USS Radford was one of the many Fletcher-class destroyers built during the Second World War. In this case, named for the admiral who'd been in overall command of the Union blockade off Hampton Roads at the time of the fight between USS Monitor and CSS Virginia. Although she was the second of this long line of destroyers to be ordered, the 5th through 7th ships of the class, Nicholas, O'Bannon and Chevalier, were laid down, launched and commissioned into the US Navy earlier than the Radford herself, which would make her the 5th Fletcher to enter service after the aforementioned ships and of course USS Fletcher herself. Ultimately, Radford would commission on the 22nd of July 1942, just in time for the war in the Pacific to start getting rather interesting. Nonetheless, her first operational theatre was the Atlantic, as part of various anti-submarine patrols once her shakedown cruise was completed. In this role, she was present near Halifax in Canada, when the former liner SS Manhattan, now the fast transport USS Wakefield, caught fire, and Radford was drafted in along with a number of cruisers and other large vessels to help deal with the situation. By the end of the year, she was considered fully operational and ready for a stint in the Pacific, starting her voyage over to this new ocean on the 5th of December 1942, where she would join Task Force 67.5 and get stuck into bombardment operations in the Guadalcanal combat zone by the end of January. These varied between more offensive bombardments of enemy positions and staging areas, and more defensive bombardments that covered the advance and landing of US troops, whilst also keeping an eye out for Imperial Japanese submarines. Of course, Japanese aircraft also made an appearance, and she would gradually begin to rack up a kill tally of these as well, becoming one of the first ships to successfully engage and destroy enemy aircraft blind, using only her radar and fire control systems to engage them without any visual sighting. During this period, she would be assigned to a smaller formation tasked with intercepting one of the numerous runs of the Tokyo Express, which in this case resulted in the Battle of Kula Gulf between 3 Brooklyn-class light cruisers, along with 4 destroyers, including the Radford, against a 10-strong Imperial Japanese Navy destroyer formation that was moving troops into the area. The action had somewhat mixed results. 2 of the destroyers on the Japanese side were sunk, and 2 damaged, and about 2/3 of the Japanese troops were prevented from landing. But this came at the cost of the cruiser USS Helena, which was hit by 3 long-lance torpedoes and sunk. Radford and Nicholas would remain in the area to rescue survivors, exchanging fire with various Imperial Japanese warships that were trying to do the same thing for their own side. This action would earn her a Presidential Unit Citation for bravery shown and damage inflicted. Unfortunately, a week later, the Battle of Kolombangara, otherwise known as the Second Battle of Kula Gulf, which was pretty much an attempt to repeat the intercept on another Japanese convoy, went somewhat less well. Despite drafting in an additional half-dozen destroyers for a total of 10, and having the Leander-class light cruiser HMNZS Leander substituting for the Helena, being matched up against a much smaller enemy force of 1 light cruiser and 5 destroyers. This time, however, the Japanese ships had spotted the Allies first and launched their torpedoes before turning away when the Allied vessels swung to present their broadsides. Although the light cruiser Jintsu was sunk, the Leander, the St. Louis, and the Honolulu all took torpedo hits, and all 3 cruisers were badly damaged, whilst the destroyer Gwyn was hit by another torpedo and sunk. The Japanese landings this time would be successful, although the follow-up Japanese plan to shell the US Marines in the area once they'd landed their own troops was abandoned. After a brief spell down south in Australian and New Zealand ports, she would return to continue attacking enemy targets around Guadalcanal, and would manage to sink the submarine I-19, which had previously sunk the carrier USS Wasp, and she would potentially also sink the I-40 shortly thereafter. Reports vary. By the end of 1943, she was recalled to San Francisco for a refit and upgrades, improving her weapons fit for further operations, and heading back into action in February 1944, easing back into combat operations with some fleet escort missions before expanding her role to once again include gunfire support missions off various islands. Although, along with a quick visit to Pearl Harbor for repairs, This would characterise most of her operations for the rest of the war until January 1945, when, whilst trying to take a ship in tow which had hit a mine, she also hit a mine and was damaged, which would see her return to the west coast for repairs that would take her past the end of the war, having collected 12 battle stars for her operations. After a stint in mothballs, she was brought back into service in 1949 as an escort destroyer, or DE, as opposed to a previous destroyer or DD designation, in which configuration she would conduct 3 tours off the coast of Korea, operating with US carrier forces and Royal Navy units. Although now configured as a specialist anti-submarine vessel, the somewhat surprising lack of North Korean submarines and the old draw of combat meant that she would find herself helping out in a number of shore bombardment missions as well, racking up another 5 combat stars in this war, taking her up to a total of 17. Following the end of the Korean War, she would continue to operate in the Pacific, helping out with guarding the recovery area for some of the early space rocket launches and taking part in numerous exercises, until in 1960 she was given the Fram II overhaul, acquiring a helicopter and deck in the process at the expense of most of her gun and torpedo armament. After which she was redesignated back to DD-446, given new sonar equipment, and then sent to bombard Vietnamese targets off of Yankee Station, as well as supporting other US Navy operations in the area for a period of about 3 years in the late 1960s, collecting another set of 5 battle stars, taking her to a total of 22. By this point, she was thoroughly worn out, and Radford was decommissioned at San Francisco in 1969 and sold for scrap in October 1970. But she still had enough energy for one last fight, and she would slip the tow of the tug taking her to the scrapyard, and then lead the tug and the other ships involved on a merry all-day chase towards the Oregon coast, before they eventually managed to catch up with her again.
That's it for this video. Thanks for watching. If you have a comment or suggestion for a ship to review, let us know in the comments below. Don't forget to comment on the pinned post for dry dock questions.